Laura Carlin is an award-winning London-based ceramicist and illustrator whose eye-catching designs and quirky sculptures have developed a cult following in the UK and abroad. Laura's accolades include winning the Bratislava Children's Book Illustration Awards and being the first Brit to hold this title in 20 years. She won the Quentin Blake Illustration Prize 2 years in a row while studying for her Masters at the Royal College of Art, from where she graduated in 2004. Laura met with Nikki Gamble to talk about her latest title, Your Mind is Like the Sky.
I'd like to start really by exploring a little bit about your background and whether you had always intended to be an illustrator or some other kind of artist, because you went to the Royal College of Art, didn't you?
It wasn't. I would describe myself as ambitious. I think once I found illustration, I really went with it. But I didn't. It's not like nowadays where illustration is quite a sort of well-known word and people know what an illustrator does. I didn't know what it was. I just knew I wanted to do art, and I come from a very academic family, so it was quite obvious from quite an early age that I couldn't spell, and I liked drawing and colouring in and interpreting things in visual stories. And then luckily enough I found a job that went alongside that, which sounds much neater than it actually was, but I was probably 19, 20 when somebody mentioned the word illustration. Before then, I guess I'd been going along this sort of fine art route, not really questioning it or knowing what it meant. So I love working to a brief, and I love telling stories with pictures. So it is pretty great.
Okay. I mean, you seem to chart your own path. Your work is recognisably yours. There isn't anything else out there that's like it. It doesn't fit into any particular pattern. So I suppose I'm asking really whether there were particular illustrators that you admired, or whether it's something that just came from entirely within yourself.
It comes from, I think, a level of romance, nostalgia and storytelling within my family. So I wouldn't say it comes from, I mean, there are definitely illustrators I greatly admire, but I'm quite careful not to look at too much illustration. I look at children's books all the time, but I'm careful not to look at illustrators because you can get very sort of bogged down with the style perhaps of something as opposed to kind of the meaning or integrity of it. And I always responded, both as a child and as an adult, to children's books that didn't patronise, and I think they're quite rare. Still, I think they're quite rare. And I think I can go too far with that and go too abstract in my own work, but I think as a child I loved the idea that somebody was talking to me in a mischievous way, but they weren't putting a hat on to say, now I'm talking to children. And I think that applies to both authors and illustrators. I think I like the idea that it's for everyone.
I'd like to pick up on what you said there about style versus integrity in a way. When I think about the picture books that have the greatest connection with me, they are books that have soul in them. So I will go back to John Birmingham. I will go back to David McKee. And I do actually think that it's quite rare. I think there's a cleverness sometimes, but actually that's not what a great picture book is about. It's got a soul to it. And that's not about technique, is it?
It's not about technique. And see, even you mentioning those two names, my hairs stand on end, because John Birmingham, luckily he was great enough and popular enough that he could do really what he wanted, and he earned that. But the continuity, sometimes he has a random page where he's used a completely different medium. But it doesn't matter. It's not about this polished book. It's about, responding to a text and being able to channel that childlike brain of yours. And that's not childlike as in naive or faux naive. It's play, basically. It's play. It's being able to look at the world and not be bogged down by all the boring things that happen as an adult. It's looking at the world and actually looking and finding adventure in it. And I think so few people do that. And that's what I personally don't think I achieve it, but that's what I'm going for. I think you're always going for the next thing. You're always trying to get that spirit.
Yes. Yeah.
And sometimes with children's books, it is a laboured affair, and I think I make it incredibly laboured. I sort of go around the houses to get to the final thing, and I think you're constantly trying to keep the energy and keep that freshness going, because that either comes off the page or it's stale.
Are you quite particular about the texts that you will accept?
I've been basically, and I'm not saying this in a false modest way, I've been very lucky. I mean, I've had Ted Hughes, I've had Nicola, and then I've had this, I've been spoilt. So luckily I've responded to them in an immediate emotional way. Otherwise I couldn't do them. But it's not like the phone's ringing off the hook. So when I first got given the Iron Man, I'm wondering to myself if I had been given a text that wasn't as good. I was just so happy to be entering children's books, because none of my portfolio showed that. I was into very sort of macabre subjects, and I think I was very naive about the strength of children's books. I always was slightly snobby or insecure about it and would say I'm far too dark to do children's books. And then it took me growing up, I think, to realise that they are the most important thing for both children and adults.
Childhood is quite a dark place.
Yes, it is. It
I think about Paula Rego's nursery rhymes, for example.
Yeah.
Not all children will respond to that.
No.
But there is a child, and the child within me was one that responded to the darkness.
Yes, as was I. And I think it's very interesting. Recently I've been listening to writers like David Sedaris' his Christmas stories, where he's talking about being an elf and things, and he said, the adults are sort of having a go at their children and saying, "Sit for Santa," and he said they're just trying to create that perfect world for their child. And I've had a child, I understand you want life to be easy for them and you want the best, but I also think they're up for it.
I know he's much maligned, and it's a problematic text. But Bruno Bettelheim, in his uses of enchantment, talks about if you're going to nourish the light, you've got to nourish the dark.
Absolutely.
As well. And regardless of the difficulties with his text, I actually think that's probably true.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
It was really interesting in Your Mind is Like the Sky, trying to illustrate the girl's worries. As an adult, it's quite easy to laugh at children's worries and think, you just wait till you've got a mortgage, but actually they're enormous. School is their world, and I really enjoy reminding myself of that side of sort of adolescence.
Yeah. Let's come to the book, which is the text is by Bronwyn Ballard. When you were given the text for this, can we go into the detail of how you actually approach a commission like this? What's the starting point for you?
So I'm maybe going to be too honest. I saw in the subject heading of the email, it said mindfulness, and I sort of backed away. I think mindfulness is wonderful, but it's a word at the moment that is banded around for a lot of things that I don't think are appropriate. And luckily opened the email and read the text and immediately responded to it. It was Rachel Williams that sent it to me. And I just thought it's not a poem, but I thought it was so beautifully balanced in the amount of words and the tone of it that I just responded to it immediately. And I thought, I wish I'd had this as a child. I wish I'd been told that you're not always going to be happy and that there isn't a way to sort of suddenly make that better. And then I went round the houses. I mean, I really did, because when I respond to something emotionally, it's like I'm almost too stuck in my own head and don't think of the audience enough. And luckily, Zoe Tucker, the designer, she got involved. And she was brilliant. She got me to sometimes visually explain things more and describe something more and be more eloquent, I think, with the illustrations.
It seems to me it's quite a difficult text to illustrate. It's not strong on story, for instance. So story has to come from the illustration, really.
Yes, you're right. And you've got this main character, and she didn't start as a main character. It started as different characters for different emotions, which seems funny now to think about it, because I know that a strong crutch of a book, children's book, as a main character to follow. So at first it was lots of different characters. The black cloud thing, basically when I sketched up immediate responses, the black cloud, when I did it in pencil or watercolour, the same medium as the illustration, it never looks strong enough. And I know what a black cloud feels like, and it feels quite heavy. And so I knew I wanted that photographed, even if it looked quite visually uncomfortable. I wanted it to be a different consistency to the rest of the page.
Right.
So we just photographed, myself and Dominic Lee, a photographer, photographed these shadows. And I knew I wanted that. I knew I wanted that slight uncomfortableness of there's no avoiding this black cloud.
Yeah. What about the other materials that you use?
Yeah.
Tell me what it is that you use to create these images.
I use acrylic and watercolour and pencil, and now to use just one would seem quite funny to me or static to me. I'm using them to try and keep up this energy.
Right.
And because the sky is so dominant as a subject and a theme in this book, for days I would just make these ink backdrops. So I wet the paper thoroughly and then I drop ink on it and move the ink around to try and create this cloud effect. And what's really lovely is it's quite an artistic endeavour in terms of you've got these sheets of paper which you're kind of balancing ink around, but you know the feeling you want to get. For example, is she talking about a quick racing thought, or is she talking about a static heavy thought? So you're trying to create that movement within the ink on the paper. And I loved doing that. And then I choose a few that I feel have worked. And then I work on a few at the same time. So I will work on, for example, the first double page spread. I will work on a few of that double page spread at the same time. It all sounds very tweaky, but what that does is it takes away that pressure of, this has got to be great. If you work on a few at the same time, you tend to be quicker, which is strange because you're doing 3 instead of 1.
Right.
And you lose that preciousness, you keep an energy up. And then one tends to come forward as being better than the others.
Wow, that's interesting.
I think you have to find ways of tricking yourself that you're not ever doing a final piece. I know a lot of students find that really hard. They're enjoying, loving a project and really finding something in it and then doing the final piece and completely tensing up and not knowing how to handle it.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to trick myself that nothing is a final piece.
When you say you're working on 3 spreads at the same time, the composition is the same in all of them, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily, but normally more similar than you think. You know, it's not dramatically different. I will normally have quite a clear idea. But I'm quite a nightmare to work with because I don't really like doing lots of roughs because I'm constantly nervous. But that means the roughs take much longer. I find out a lot as I'm doing it with the colours and everything, and I'm just worried that if I do too many roughs, I'll deaden it.
So it's almost like not wanting something to be too polished.
Yes.
That's the killer.
It
really
is the killer. I think it's that sort of that fine line between creating something with enough. You know, I remember that feeling as a child and as an adult. I have it looking into a drawing. I love providing details and little things that you might notice on the second reading. I love all of that. So I like something to be in depth, but I don't want to cross that line where I've made it so polished that I then prevent, it's like a window between me, or glass between me and the reader. I want to invite them in and finish some things in their own head rather than just say, I'm going to tell you the entire story.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me because a book should be co-created.
Yes.
With the reader.
Yeah.
And I like that idea that it's an invitation to do that. I think when I look at your books, one of the things that really appeals to me is the figure in them, the body language. I'm just thinking about Nicola Davies, The Promise, and just the front cover. You just have this way of instantly capturing, for me, a character through body language. I just think it's amazing. Do you draw a lot? Do you draw from life? Or?
I draw from life much less than I used to, but I would write notes sometimes if I haven't got time to be out drawing. I would write notes about somebody's body language as a shorthand. But that's why I'm an illustrator, is people's body language. So I'm so happy you respond to it, because, you know, on those days where you're in a bit of a grump, or it's not going well, or you're just a bit stale, you've looked at Google Image too much, you go out and it's just fascinating, people's body language. You know, tiny shrug of the shoulders tells you whether somebody's happy or sad. It's so minute, actually, much more minute than you think. And actually I found that quite hard in Your Mind Is Like the Sky, because I've got to show quite dramatic emotions like anger.
Yeah.
And I'm not really used to that. I'm used to much more subtle body language. And I used to be commissioned, when there was a lot more editorial around, I used to be commissioned to do a lot of quite difficult subjects, because I think you can't show explicitly something very difficult, but you could show through a subtle bit of body language that perhaps a child is hurting or grieving, you know. So I used to do a lot of quite difficult subjects.
Yeah, and sometimes I'm just trying to picture that front cover for a moment, and I think in the background there are people in the distance.
Yes.
And actually they're virtually just lines.
Yes.
But you can actually tell how they're thinking about their day, which again
I'm really
is amazing.
happy,
you know, they're not just lines. You actually do know what's going on there.
I think when you speak to, you know, an amazing writer, or listen to an interview with a writer, and I get a lot of my inspiration from reading, they don't think their characters are made up, do they? They think they all exist around them in whatever form. And I think if you don't believe that they exist, you're in trouble.
I wonder, just so that we can talk in a little bit more detail about an illustration as an example, perhaps we could have a look at something that you, maybe a spread that you felt particularly satisfied with. I get the sense you're quite critical of your own work, really, but something that you were particularly pleased with.
It might be this spread, which is, it says, thoughts come and go for us all of the time. Half the time they've been and gone before you've even really noticed. And it's of the girl playing in a sandpit, and that lovely, you know, she's just oblivious to all around her. She's just playing. And I remember that as a child, and I see it in my boy, where they can't even hear you, you know, when you're trying to speak to them. I don't like much of my work, but I like this spread because this was the spread where I made it and I thought, I'm going to draw. It is not photorealistic, but this is quite realistic for me. It's a slightly different way of drawing people, because I didn't want to fictionalise what's a very real text, you know, about real emotions. And so it was a sort of marker for me that I thought, oh, I'm going to draw the rest of the book in this way, where lots of the other characters are outlines, but I'm really trying to look at people's body language. I'm really trying to sum it up and not over stylise it, because I think that would only get in the way of the content.
When you read a page like this, obviously your eye is drawn to the main character here, but on a second reading you're much more likely to be looking at what's going on. As you say, they're very light outlines, the other characters, but there's a lot to look at and observe in that picture after. So you are, and I want to say artist, you know, an illustrator artist, but you are an artist. You work like an artist, don't you?
So, I think so.
And you've had international recognition. Thinking about that for a moment, do you think that illustration is a universal language, or does it almost need translating culturally?
No, I think it is universal, but I think it's much more about your bias. I'm sure there's some countries you're naturally going to feel an affinity with, but I personally felt when I went to Bologna, I connected with a lot more. It's not that I feel a disconnection with the UK publishing scene, but I found that I could respond a lot more to a lot more of the European titles.
Yes. Your style feels, well, style is the wrong word, really, but it feels European in some respects.
Yes.
That it would be at home there. I wanted to ask you a little bit. I know that you've also branched into ceramics.
Yes.
What does that give you as an artist?
It's great. I mean, it's not always, they don't always go hand in hand. I think when you do something creative, people always assume that you get up each day and skip to the easel or to the desk and put on your smock and are just inspired. And I just went through this period where I felt quite depressed and bored, and I think you just get to know your own work too much. And even though you're getting, you know, a book project, you know, what you've always dreamed of, you're just a bit bored. And so I started these ceramics evening classes, and what that did was it made me look again. You know, when I'm making an animal out of clay, I'm only just about making it. I'm trying to think what it is about a puma or a jaguar or a dog that makes it a dog or a puma or a jaguar. So it does make you look.
When I've seen those images, they look, I don't mean this, I hope this doesn't come across in the wrong way, but almost like a child might do with plasticine.
Yeah. Again, I'm just trying not to overkill something and sort of deaden it. I'm trying to keep that energy. So that's how that happened. It wasn't, I definitely didn't have a business venture in mind with ceramics. But I think that boredom thing isn't talked about enough sometimes at college. I think everybody has it, whatever job they do, but that horrible bit in a project where you just feel bored, or it's horrible, or it's difficult.
Yeah. Can I ask you about a world of your own? There are lots of books out there telling children how to draw. My dad was an artist, and I was desperate for him to teach me, and he would never show me how to do it. So when you came to approach this project, which is about encouraging children to be artists, it's very different from the how to draw, put a line here and then a line here. So why did you want to make this book?
I felt really strongly about this book. I mean, the fact is I'm going against, I think, what naturally happens often when you're about 7 or 8 years old, and I don't want to say this, but it's often in girls, where you basically think there's a correct way of drawing. And I went through it, and it continued for me till I was about 18. I thought that a good drawing was a photorealistic drawing. And so I was trying to throw that out the window. But I know that those how-to draw books sell in their droves because children respond to that. They want to know a correct way of doing something. I wanted to go against that, which is why I used models and drawings and paintings and folded bits of card, because in an ideal world I wanted a child that actually didn't like drawing to respond to the book, because maybe they could make something out of a matchbox. So when I first started making visuals for the project, I really got into it and made these paintings and drawings. But actually, they were too about my world. They were too selfish, really. And so, bringing in these other mediums and things I was trying to hold a child's hand and say, here's the seed of an idea. Look at the transport in the world, or look at people. How would you make it? And there is not a correct way of making it. I'm basically trying to encourage them to be children for longer, I guess.
Yes, yeah.
And play.
Tell me a little bit about being given the commission to do the Iron Man. I mean, what an amazing text. How did you feel when that came to you, and what did you want to try to convey from that story?
So, I mean, I was so lucky. It was Liz Wood, who I have to thank for basically a career at Walker Books, that got me in. She was rightly nervous about this huge text, because I had never done children's books before, and I basically disappeared for a while, made her really panic. And I think some of that was being incredibly insecure about illustrating a text that I thought was already visually rich enough, to the point that I almost didn't think it needed illustrating. And when you speak to people about the Iron Man, because it was often, especially with boys, it was often a book that really spoke to them, and people get quite shiny-eyed about it, and I was thinking, what am I going to do? So I had to find a way of, an excuse to illustrate it. And so my excuse was that I felt like Ted Hughes' empathy lay with this Iron Man, whereas I felt like other authors would make the Iron Man a baddie, an evil thing. And actually, Ted Hughes, if anything, looked badly upon the people. And I really thought that was great. And so I gave the Iron Man a shadow. He was the only real thing. So he was a paper cutout, whereas the people were just drawing. So I worked with this photographer, Dominic Lee, and it was just this delicious process of kind of using printing inks and making these textures, and then cutting the Iron Man out to make this shadow, and drawing the world around him, and just trying to find a way in that added to the text as opposed to flattened it. And then at the end of the book, everyone realises the error of their ways and they learn how to live together. So they all get a shadow. So that was a big set, a 3D set that we set up. And it was just, I don't think I was particularly professional about it. I remember sort of phone call upon phone call from Liz, you know, leaving messages on my answer phone. Have you done anything? But I tend to think about it for a long, long time and then make the work quite intensely.
Are you somebody that doesn't like to share partway through a process?
Yes, I'm terrible at it, and that's horrible for the poor publisher. I'm terrible at it. They're like my babies. You know, once you're into a book, you go to bed thinking about it. You're on a bus and you think about it. Once you're in that world, you don't want anybody to break you out of it because you know you're onto a good thing. So the idea of showing somebody a half-finished drawing and then being like, oh, why didn't you do this? Is too painful.
So apart from A World of Your Own, all of your other books, I think, have been in response to other people's texts. Can you see yourself writing your own text to illustrate or not? You're shaking your head, so this doesn't appeal.
It's not that it doesn't appeal. I guess I hold writers up to such an extent. I idolise the ability to write. And I think, again, it's one of those things that until you try and do it, you don't realise how hard it is. I think so many students are like, I'm going to be an author and an illustrator, and I think those are two enormous things to try and conquer. And I'm just not a writer. I love writing. I love writing letters and emails, which sounds a funny thing. I love telling stories through writing, but I'm not a writer.
So can I finally ask if you're working on a new text at the moment? Don't tell me too much. I know you won't want to give a lot away, but are you working on something at the moment?
I'm working on something with Walker called The Nightingale, which is so exciting, but it's almost too much pressure because it's just such a great story.
Is it a retelling of a traditional story?
Yes. It's about how the nightingale got its voice.
Oh, right, okay.
And then I'm also doing a book for Bloomsbury, which is a young adult book. So it's black and white drawings. And that's just really enjoyable. It's a really different kettle of fish. You know, the text is obviously different. The subject is much more difficult in terms of its difficult themes. And so it's just interesting responding to something of a different format and a different age group. So I'm lucky the two are very nicely diverse, you know, from one another. Did
you do the illustration for the Silver Donkey?
Yes, that was the
first. And that's black and white, isn't it? So how is that different working in black and white? What considerations do you have to...
I think you try and push the illustration even further because so I will probably be more playful with design.
Right.
Because you're limited to black and white, so you've sort of taken away that bit of you that's like, what colour shall I use now? And so you add in, I think, another bit, which is design. I like to think I try and design always, but colour definitely blurs the lines, whereas with black and white, you're trying to push the limits a bit more.
Right.
And make the text work around it a bit more. And you're thinking much more about what's linear and what's a wash, and it's great.
Fantastic. Laura, can I thank you so much for coming and talking to me in the Reading Corner today and bearing with my artistically naive questions. It's been such a delight talking to you.
It's been a delight for me too.